I am Truth Seeker, and I'm a very, very lucky individual. I'm a sex abuse victim. I survived growing up in a cult, and I'm very fortunate to have such a wonderful family. A little grandson who's the joy of my life, a beautiful little thing. My wife, my daughter, as you can see, she's a musician, and somehow my life worked out, and I couldn't have asked for anything more, anything better. And I worked hard for my family, but it could have all been ruined. Sex abuse victims don't often, they're not lucky. They're not lucky this way. Often it has lifelong impacts. It still has lifelong impacts with me. I have to still seek counseling for the damage that was done, the psychological and emotional damage that was done. But I'm one of the lucky ones. There are many that can't survive. There are many that commit suicide, like my younger brother. And that's the tragic thing about sex abuse is what it does emotionally and psychologically to the individuals who suffered from that. Children are vulnerable little things. They need us adults to protect them. They need the love and attention and care because they can't do it for themselves. And when they fall prey to an evil, I think if there's anything that really truly is evil in this world, it's the sexual abuse of a child because they can't protect themselves. They're objectified by the sick individual who has taken advantage of them for their own sick uh, pleasure, their sick advantage, their sick sense of wanting power over an innocent and harmless little individual. If somebody had ever done anything to harm my grandson, I don't know what I would do. That's how strong I feel about that little boy. And to think, that I didn't have that care. Nobody loved me that much is something that really is hard for me to grasp. When I was a small boy like him, when I was an innocent little child who had to depend on his parents for everything and to fall prey to the predator. So when I hear about sex abuse and sex abuse cases like the Montana case and Watchtower, I don't think that there's reparations enough that can be made. There should be no statute of limitations. I was listening to the In Focus from Lloyd Evans the other day, and they had one of the lawyers that participated in that case talking, and he said one of the saddest things that he had to tell people was that they had been abused. Yes, they they were victims of sexual abuse, but that the statute of limitations had passed. But the statute of limitations for the damage done, there is none. It lasts a lifetime. Yes, you can recover, and yes, you can have a wonderful life. I've been able to escape the awful ramifications that being growing up in a cult and having also been sexually abused by a parent, no less, the one who's supposed to be a caretaker, the one who's supposed to love you the most. I survived somehow, but I could have just as well ended up in my brother's shoes and ended up taking my life. My brother's life was a tragic life. It ruined him. And I know he suffered abuse from my mother in the same way I suffered abuse from my mother. It's in the psych reports. It's in the reports from his multiple visits to the psych ward where he talked to a counselor, and it was all documented in these reports. My mother was not a well person. She should not have had 3 boys to raise. And my father didn't step in. My father didn't care enough about us. All he cared about was his eldership and his position in the Bible students, and to step back and take care of what really mattered. When I was 17 years old, he pulled me aside and scolded me for not being a better example to my brothers. That it was my fault that their behavior was beginning to deviate from into drug abuse and alcohol use and cigarette smoking at a young age. It was my fault for them because I was not a good example. And he bemoaned the fact that one of my friends' father um, had declined his eldership because he didn't feel like he had control over his family, and that was one of the criteria for being an elder. And it's in Timothy to have control over his family. A person that had no control over his family technically was not supposed to be an elder. And this brother, whose son was a good friend of mine, felt that he didn't have the necessary control over his son, over his family, to conscientiously be an elder in his ecclesia. And my father didn't want that to happen to him. He was desperate. He was pleading with me and then ordering me to be an example to my brothers and to take responsibility for their behavior so that he didn't have to give up his eldership. That's all that mattered to him. That Montana case is an important case because Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has taken a stand, has drawn its battle lines at that point, at that level of the two witness rule, to preserve this two witness rule, which is the rule that's hurting so many innocent little children, innocent, who can't watch out for themselves, who are powerless against these predators And apparently, this predator in the Montana case is loose in Mexico. He sought refuge in Mexico, part of the organization. There's no cure for pedophilia. There's no cure for pedophilia. Very, very rare that that condition can be reversed. And so there's no question that he's doing this to children down in Mexico. I don't know the particulars of that Montana case in terms of the damage and the exact circumstances of the abuse, but I know from firsthand what it does to you psychologically, how it impacts your sense of self-worth, and how it makes you feel like you're not worth anything, that you're lesser than other people, that you're not as good as other people, that you don't deserve to be treated like other people because there's something wrong with you. And it takes a long, long time to be able to reverse the effects and the impacts of having been sexually abused. And in many cases, it just can't be reversed. The damage is done. Yeah, there's a statute of limitations, but not for the damage that it does. Now, that case in Montana, I was really, really glad to hear that Watchtower took it took it hard, that they were so inept that they lost that case readily, hands down. That there was it only took 3 days for that case to be won by the plaintiff. Watchtower didn't show any care or remorse for the victims. They don't want they don't think of people as being of value. They have no concern for the individual whatsoever, and they say so. They tell you independent thinking is wrong. Well, independent thinking is what makes a human being who they are. Critical thinking is what makes a person who they are, to be able to think for themselves. Watchtower doesn't want people to think for themselves so they can take advantage of them. They drew the battle line at the two witness rule, a rule that is hurting thousands of children every year, a rule that should be abolished within the practices of the and policies of the church. Here they teach that God is a God of righteousness. But how does a God of righteousness permit the abuse of a small child, an innocent little child that can't protect themselves, whose only experience of life should be joy and happiness and love and trust for the people around them, their family. I mean, that's all my grandson has is us, and he trusts us, and we love him. When that little boy sat on my lap, I felt a wave of love that I couldn't tell you how deep it ran. Watching my daughter on stage playing her viola in that concert, and my little grandson clapping his hands and saying, "Yay, mommy." My God, That life to him should be joy. Life to a little child should be nothing but joy, not pain, not needless pain. And that's what Watchtower is inflicting upon children purposely. They deserve to be penalized. They deserve to be penalized out of business if they don't change that policy. I think that policy is worse than shunning, and shunning is awful. Shunning is an unspeakable crime to separate families. But the damage done to a small child as a result of sexual abuse is immeasurable. And it is the most evil thing that could be done to a human being. So I have very strong feelings in this area, as you can see. And I think that Watchtower needs to pay the penalty over and over and over again until they learn their lesson and put people first, put children first beyond their own needs, their own doctrines and teachings, and it's intolerable. It's something that should not be tolerated. And how they could draw the battle line at this when it could be so easily changed. The Watchtower is such a hypocritical organization because there are circumstances over and over and over again when they change their doctrines, when they change their policies. And here is a clear cut policy that protects the most innocent of us, our children. And it's not just Jehovah's Witness children, because by not turning over a pedophile to the authorities when they know about it, is leaving this person loose in society where they can hurt other children. Do you think they would limit their 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 interest in just Jehovah's Witness children? Maybe the congregation makes it convenient for these people to act out their sick compulsions, but they're in society and they'll hurt any small child. They don't care who it is. They don't have any discretion. There's no selection or exclusivity between Jehovah's Witness children and worldly children. These pedophiles are out in public and they will hurt any child when the situation arises that they can do it and not get caught. And now this man is in Mexico. Yes, Watchtower paid $35 million. They're going to appeal. They're going to try and get that $35 million reversed. They had done that with Candace Conti. They had taken a 20 some odd $1 million judgment against the Watchtower and on appeal reduced it to a substantially smaller amount. And they expect to do the same with this Montana case. And they're going to try and use Montana law to do so. I read the statute. It was interesting because I was looking at. I had heard that this was the first time that Watchtower finances could be assessed because the penalty, the punitive penalty, um, was based on a percentage of the net worth the of the defendant. The defendant in this case being the Watchtower. Now, I looked at the statute myself, and the punitive damages were justified on the basis of the fact that um, with civil cases, they operate differently than criminal cases. With criminal cases, the prosecution has to establish the guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond reasonable doubt. And that is a very high bar. That is the most burden of proof that has to be established in order to find a person guilty of a criminal infraction. In a civil case, the bar is much lower for the plaintiff to have to make, the case that the plaintiff has to make in order to get a jury conviction. And that's what occurred in this situation. And the judgment was for $4 million. The legal counsel for the plaintiff asked for $3 million. And they so well established the malice of the Watchtower Society that the jury decided to award $1 million more than what the plaintiff had asked for. So they got $4 million instead of 3, which was what they asked for. But then the judge noted that there was a mandatory notification that the elders had deliberately failed to pursue, to follow up on. And as a result of that, there was another deliberation for punitive damages because of this failure to report. It violated Montana law. And so the Watchtower was responsible for not only the civil suit that was brought against them, but also punitive damages as a result of having failed to make this notification. They violated the Montana law. Now, the punitive damages in Montana have a cap in the statute, and I looked that up. And what they have is a monetary cap of $10 million or 3% of the net worth of the defendant if the defendant is found guilty, indeed guilty. Now, this is where people think, well, we can calculate the net worth of Watchtower because the penalty was based on that. Well, it was turned out that the legal counsel mentioned that in this case the jury had ignored this statutory limitation for a penalty and enacted their own judgment on this. And the way the penalty reads is that the penalty, punitive damages, should be capped at $10 million or 3% of the net worth of the defendant, and whichever is lower. So what this says is that no penalty can exceed $10 million. If the if the defendant is a major corporation that is got $100 million in revenue, and believe me, there are some companies like the energy companies that do make over $100 million in revenue in a year. Pharmaceuticals make 40 to $50 million in revenue a year, $1 billion in revenue a year. Um, the the jury is to assess 3% of the net worth, which includes all of the assets, both liquid and those assets that, such as properties and other things that can be made liquid but are not in liquid form, investments and things like that. They were to take the net total worth of the corporation, 3%, and then take what's lower of the two. And $10 million, certainly in the case of Watchtower, would be the lower of the two. So we still really don't know what Watchtower's net worth is. If you take 3% of, if you divide $31 million by the 3%, you get something like $1 billion. And Watchtower certainly has a lot more than that. Even in liquid assets, I'm certain it has a heck of a lot more cash than that. The Warwick property alone, while it may have cost them substantially less to build because they had free labor, they could take that property and sell it today for easily $500 million. They have properties like this all around the world. They have different corporations that have different net worths. So, and plus they have cash. So while Watchtower may be hurting financially from a budgeting point of view, when they say, we need the money that we have spent for the work that we planned is less than the money coming in, that it doesn't mean that Watchtower is in trouble from a financial point of view. People can misread that kind of a statement because what I have planned may not necessarily even be reasonable. Maybe I have a lot more work I want to get done. I'm much more ambitious, and I'm not getting enough revenues, and I try to exact that. I have the money over here somewhere, but I'm expecting it to come from over there, and so they will plead for money and get it, and say, well, give the idea that there's some kind of a shortfall, that the Watchtower is hurting. Well, they're not hurting. This is a corporation who's had the chance to make money tax free all over the world, from decades and decades, and I'm certain that there's money that they've never been held accountable for the money they make. Nobody has done any kind of financial scrutiny. There was some kind of a leak some years ago, to I think it was Newsweek magazine, when they were rating the top 40 businesses in New York. I think it was a 2002 report, and Watchtower was identified as one of the top 40 earning corporations in New York City. And they were down somewhere around 32. They weren't at the bottom of the list, but they weren't at the top either. And at the time, they were claimed to have been somewhere around $900 million a year in revenue. And that's tax-free revenue. That's revenue that doesn't have to really go. There's some, they have expenses, they have overhead, they had operating expenses, but that was the revenue that they get uh, from bequests and from donations and other sources of income that they have. Most of that income is not reportable. They don't have to report it. There is a small amount of income that they do have to report because it comes from sources that are not exempt from the tax-free status, but it's a very small amount, and you can find that on the IRS. But these lawsuits, this $35 million is a lot of money, but it's still there's a long way to go to make Watchtower really feel the pain to the point where either they change the policy because they've drawn the battle lines, they've made it clear we are not giving up the two witness rule, they don't care how many children it hurts. How many children are going to have to suffer lifelong psychological damage about their self-worth, their self-esteem? And how many of those children are going to commit suicide? How many of those children are going to go through life feeling like they're inferior to other people? Watchtower has to be made to feel the pain. They don't care about anybody. And this is the kind of God that they reflect. Now, there are thousands of sects of Christianity. Watchtower is a perfect example, and this is why I focus on the history of Watchtower, because they are a perfect example of how an organization can become really toxic and in an insidious and subtle way become toxic. And it occurred really during Rutherford's presidency. That's the transition. That's when it occurred. When he took the power, then he took the reins, when he incorporated terror and fear, the fear of Jehovah, the wrath of God into the members of the body that made up the membership of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society to follow and to do what they were directed to do. Without fear, the Watchtower wouldn't be the same organization, but they used fear as the means by which they got their membership to do exactly what they want them to do. And that's taking people and making them feel unimportant, and they tell you you are unimportant. The only thing that is important is Jehovah, and they are Jehovah's representative, and they're the ones that have to be listened to. They're the ones that dictate Jehovah's precepts and values. And if there's any God like the God that the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in, he's an awful, awful God who who takes more pleasure in blood and in destroying than he does in saving and making people live life happily. They're talking about a world of forever, that people live in fear of this great Jehovah, or they lose their lives in an awful manner. Who wants to live forever like that? Living forever in fear, and fear for their loved ones, that their loved ones, their beloved children, are going to make a mistake and Jehovah's going to take their life? Is that the kind of God you want to serve? And this is awful. And they use the Bible to make this kind of a God up. This is why I don't believe in the Bible anymore. Because what the Bible students believe is not too far away from it. The Bible students, they talk with the same level of disdain about the world as do Jehovah's Witnesses. They stay separate from the world in the same way as Jehovah's Witnesses. And unfortunately, unlike Jehovah's Witnesses, when abuses do take place, and I'm sure they do in the Bible students, there's no organization to sue. What do you do in that circumstance when a child? You have to take it up individually. You have to take it to the police yourself. But with the Watchtower has such control over their membership that they hold their own judicial committees. They try these things internally with their own policies. And they have policies that affect the people's lives, that allow, that absolutely result in these types of abuses that occur. There is no good reason for the two witness rule whatsoever. And yet, that's where the battle line has been drawn, and they're going to stay there entrenched in this belief until they're forced to change it. And that has to be through continual persistence on the part of abuse victims and those who have not been abused. This affects everybody because it doesn't just happen within the organization. This affects everybody. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand, is how broadly this policy that the Watchtower has so held on to with such inexplicable determination, such stubbornness, that it's mind-boggling. It doesn't make sense, except that it's evil. Anybody with any common sense whatsoever can see how this policy, this needless, this senseless, this completely irrelevant policy is hurting children, the most innocent of us, and they just don't care. That's why these cases have to continue. They have to be brought. They have to be prosecuted with vigor until the message has gotten to the point where Watchtower realizes that they reverse it. And that doesn't even have to be out of any kind of motive of repentance or regret. Oh, we're sorry for this. We just realized how this has hurt people. No, it's got to stop. Watchtower is never sincere about what if they believe this policy, but it has to end by at all costs. And there's no reason for why this policy needs to be extended any longer. This is an archaic rule that's been adopted by some book, 4,000-year-old sets of values that don't pertain to today's society. That will never change, left to Watchtower, because Watchtower doesn't believe it's wrong. They don't care about people. They don't have feelings about people. They are hypocrites. So I've gone on a long ways about this. I feel strongly about this. I feel strongly because it impacted my life. It impacted my brothers, and it's hurting tens of thousands of children, if not more. And because Watchtower will not move, will not budge on this policy. How many children outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses have been hurt because the witnesses have let a predator go? Because this they don't believe that it is anything more than a sin, and a sin can be repented, and that this person says, "Oh, I'm sorry," then you should give them the benefit of the doubt for repentance. No, no, those people are sick. They will never change. They will never change. And Watchtower needs to pay the penalty for the children that they don't protect, those innocent little children. If anybody had touched or hurt my grandson and I found out about it, I honestly don't know what I would do. I really couldn't tell you. I I couldn't imagine it. I'd be so full of rage. But anyway, I guess you got a sense about how I feel about this. Um, yes, shunning. Yes, the blood policy. But the worst is when they are hurting and stripping the innocence, ripping it, tearing out the innocence from a little child forever, causing damage to that child for the rest of his life, for the rest of their life. You can't. No. Money doesn't repair the damage, the psychological damage that's caused by this. The only reason those judgments should be high is to put the message to Watchtower, because that's the only way they will hear. It's the only way they will respond, is if they're forced into reversing this policy. So those are my thoughts on that. I know I've spoken strongly about it, but there's nothing more precious to me than a small child, because there's no other time in a human's life where there's such innocence, where there's such joy. Life is a joyous thing for a young child. It's an adventure. It's a time of learning this magnificent world with people around them that they love, who they feel comfortable with, and protection. And when that's ripped from them, that is not a sin. That's evil. That's evil. So these parasites, and this is an organizational parasite because they don't want to change. We're not going to change. They're so haughty. They don't care about children. Anthony Morris, every single one of those awful people who call themselves governing body members are awful people, and they do not care about children. That's for sure. They just care about their own agenda. They're parasites. So anyway, I don't want to get too much more worked up over this, but I hope that the more cases that are brought against Watchtower, the I just hope that there are enough cases brought about against Watchtower, that there are more voices speaking out against them, that they stop this awful policy, this needless policy, so that that children within the Jehovah's Witnesses and without are protected. So this is Truth Seeker here, wishing you all the best. And this is a matter that has to be addressed, and it can't wait any longer. This is an If there is an issue, it's the most important issue that needs to be addressed with Watchtower, and it needs to be sorted out now. It can't wait. This is, I think, the top priority when it comes to dealing with Watchtower. So long, everybody, and I wish you the best.